And I'm Scott. I'm from the Berkeley team, like everyone else. So we're doing the answering theory lecture. So the first step to answering theory is either reading a we meet or it's impossible to meet. And so on the we meet, it's pretty simple. How do you meet their interp? And even if you don't meet their interp, you probably meet their interp in some way. So you want to be really creative about how you actually meet their interp. So, I mean, an example is like, if they say the 1AC must do X, Y, and Z, we're not the 1AC, we're the PMC. What are you? Okay, anyway, that's like a creative we meet that you could probably read. And then the other side is the impossible to meet. So if you read like multi-actor fiat, or the AF must not do multi-actor fiat, but it's the USFG should, the USFG is made up of multiple people or like multiple actors, and you're fiating the different groups of people to do different things. So it's impossible to meet, you have to be multi-actor in that scenario.
Cool. Hi, I'm Tejas. So after you read like a we meet or an impossible to meet argument on like the interpretation itself, you want to read a competing model of debate. So interps are a model of debate that they defend where the affirmative has violated something. So a competing interpretation or a counter interpretation is a model of debate that you are a part of. So you have done like something that they say is bad. So for example, if you read conditional counterplans and they say you can't read those conditional counterplans, so your model of debate is a model of debate where conditional counterplans are allowed. So for example, your counterinterpretation in that case would be negative advocacies may be conditional, or the negative gets some X number of conditional counterplans. And so then you read a we meet under this. So you don't necessarily have to explicitly read a we meet. What you need to do is you need to make sure that you meet your own counterinterpretation. What this means is that, let's say you read 3 conditional counterplans, and your counterinterpretation is the negative gets to read 2 conditional counterplans. You don't meet that counterinterpretation, which means that's not a model of debate that you can endorse because you still violate that interpretation. Rather, if you read a counterinterpretation that is the negative gets 3 conditional counterplans, you can read a we meet that says we've defended 3 conditional counterplans in the 1NC, which means we meet this counterinterpretation. The next thing you need to make sure under this is you need to make sure that your counterinterpretation competes with their interpretation. Because under a competing interps worldview of debate, where kind of like this offense-defense paradigm, what you need to make sure is that if your interpretation is not competitive with their interpretation, it becomes like a counterplan debate, where the affirmative is reading, let's say, wind energy, and the negative reads hydroelectric energy. Both can happen at the same time, which is not a reason to disprove wind energy in the first place. In the same way, if they're saying something like, the negative must not read conditional counterplans, and you say the negative must not read 5 conditional counterplans, both can happen at the same time, which means that it's not really competitive and not a reason to vote down the interpretation. The next thing after this is that you need to justify why your model of debate is specifically better. So given that we read the negative may read 3 conditional counterplans, you need reasons on why this is better than their interpretation. So for example, one thing you can say is conditionality is good for creativity. So an example here would be we need ways to truth test the affirmative in multiple different ways. Conditionality allows us to do that because we get to brainstorm different strategies against the affirmative and then pick whatever strategy is good later on. Another argument here could be like real world education. So for example, it could be, look, in Congress, a policy like that the affirmative is endorsing is then tested by like different other strategies that might be potentially better than the affirmative, that you get to kind of kick later on if it's disproven within that round. Which means conditionality is better for real world education because if we're all quote unquote trying to become policymakers in the future, then we want to have that form of real world education. Finally, after you read all of these counter standards on why your model of debate is good, you also want to read offense on why their model of debate is bad. This is similar to how you might read a bunch of counterplans against like the affirmative, but then you also go and then line by line the affirmative itself. So for example, if they read something like, conditionality means that contradictions are gonna happen, you're gonna read like different contradictory arguments. You might say that, contradictions are good for the affirmative, or good for fairness, because you get to use our own arguments against us. That just means that it's easier for you to win the debate, which means that it's probably easier for the affirmative to win the debate when we are conditional, because like you get to use one side of the contradiction. And then if you do a lot of that fairness argumentation, then all of that line by line will also help you. So this kind of ensures that you have multiple different outs in the debate. Either you can go for the counter interpretation and the reason why your model of debate is better for fairness in education than their interp, or you can go for their interp is specifically bad for fairness in education and so thus should not be endorsed. I'll pass it off to Holden to talk about the next few things.
Hi everybody, I'm Holden. So the same way that a normal argument has links comparative to theory which has standards, it's the same way that when you're looking at theory, you should be looking at it as a link and an impact. Your impact is your voters, and your voters are fairness and education. And similarly to responding to a typical theory, like a typical normal argument, you can respond to theory by giving defense to those impacts. And those impacts or those voters typically tend to be fairness and education. So even if you lose on these standards levels or you don't have a good counterinterpretation, as long as you read reasons why those impacts or those voters aren't actually voters, then you're pretty good on the theory. So for example, you could say that fairness isn't a voter for a few reasons. First, you could say that everything is unfair in the first place. The negative gets 12 minutes in the block. The affirmative gets the last 5 minutes to speak, which means that at the end of the day, we're always going to have unfair rounds, and it's impossible to have 100% complete fairness. The education also has like a few problems. The first thing that you can say is just read a book, right? Debate isn't necessarily the only thing that you need in order to get education. You can get education through a lot of other ways. Another thing you can say is that if you're running something like a critique, you can say that sure, like you can get more education through your interpretation. However, this education can be tainted by the state, or the education can just be like not good education, which like you solve through with your critique. But at the end of the day, you can also do some other arguments on the voter level. For example, the issue of potential abuse versus actual abuse. So typically if a team were to run some standards of things like a spec argument, if they say like, oh, you should specify this because then that means that you have the potential to change up your interpretation of the plan in order to like get an advantage in the debate. Sure, that might be true, but you haven't actually done that, which could be a reason why it isn't a voter. Some reasons that you can give is that it just doesn't make sense. If you're treating theory like you do in law, for example, you aren't going to punish someone for potentially doing something. Another thing that you can say is that the logic behind like doing potential abuse is the same logic for stop and frisk laws, which are pretty bad. Another thing is, at the end of it, you're looking at the paradigm issues, and the biggest piece of contention is the reasonability versus competing interps. Always you're going to see this issue of competing interps, and to prefer competing interps typically because reasonability is arbitrary. The easy thing to say is that you should be preferring reasonability because you want the judge to evaluate the shell in a reasonable manner. For example, if there were a shell, for example, like debaters should double knot their shoes. Obviously, like this isn't a reason to vote. However, technically double knotting your shoes could be a good thing. So you could say, yeah, if you have super small violations or super frivolous theory, then that isn't necessarily a reason to vote for us because that just doesn't make sense and it's not what we do in the real world. Another thing you can say is that if they say reasonability is arbitrary, you could just give them a bright line, right? Reasonability doesn't necessarily have to be arbitrary, and you could say something like, in order for you to win your shell, you have to win all of your standards and all of the counter standards, and then everything makes sense. I'm gonna pass it off to Arjun for the final things that you should do when responding to theory.
Hi, so I'm Arjun, and one of my, as a lay debater coming from high school, one of the things that I always thought sucked about theory is that you always can never win on it, apparently, because if you're answering theory, it's a necessary but insufficient burden, right? You have to meet it, but you can never win on it. The reverse voting issue is your golden ticket to potentially win on theory. The reverse voting issue, or RVI, is a way that you can fight back against T and sort of potentially win on the sheet. So what is the RVI? Well, the idea is that the theory that they brought up could be structurally unfair. For example, it could be, as Holden said, the logic of stop and frisk. You can tag that as a reverse voting issue, and if you win that argument, you could potentially win on the sheet, but obviously you have to impact it out and do all the good debate things that you know how to do. Importantly, one of the things that T debaters often say is there should be no RVIs, because RVIs challenge you to, are bad because they stop you from trying to make the debate space more fair. Beating back that claim requires some skill, but I think it's doable. For example, you could say that no, don't vote on things like stop and frisk policies, right? You should vote on things that are more morally correct. So at that level, the RVI is your golden ticket to winning on the sheet. Now lastly, what's important is that if you don't think you can win the T-sheet, it's always important to do your layering, right? Put whatever you want to talk about above the T-sheet, and that's one way to beat back against the T-sheet's insufficient burden. One way to do that if you're running a critical app, for example, is to say something along the lines of, we are the internal connection, or the internal link to things like education and fairness, i.e. you have to first resolve the K debate before you can get on to T. Another thing you can do for running a case, for example, like a policy advantage, is talk about how you are more important because policy comes first in the round before fairness. For example, policy education should come first before meeting your necessary but insufficient burden.
Thank you. Thanks. Oh my gosh, that was great. Wow. Woo.
You.